When Officer Derek Mills saw the black man driving the silver BMW down Highway 82 at 11:47 p.m., he was already reaching for his radio. What he didn't expect was to find himself standing at attention 30 minutes later, saluting a man he'd just humiliated on the side of the road. The words that would shatter his assumptions hadn't been spoken yet, but they were coming. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Washington, United States Army Special Operations Command. The dashboard clock in Officer Mills' patrol cruiser glowed green in the Alabama darkness as he accelerated to close the gap between his Crown Victoria and the luxury sedan ahead. The BMW's Tennessee plates caught his attention first. Out-of-state drivers were always good targets, less likely to know local procedures, more likely to carry cash or contraband. The fact that it was nearly midnight on a Thursday made it even better. Honest people didn't drive expensive cars through rural Alabama at this hour. Derek Mills had been patrolling these same 23 miles of interstate for 8 years, and he developed what he called an eye for trouble. The eye that had earned him 3 commendations for drug seizures, 2 department awards for DUI arrests, and 1 formal reprimand for excessive force that his sergeant had quietly buried in his personnel file. Tonight, that I was telling him the BMW was worth a closer look. The sedan maintained exactly 75 miles per hour in the 70 zone, just enough over the limit to justify a stop, but not enough to suggest the driver was trying to flee. Professional criminals drove like this, Mills thought. Just fast enough to make time, just slow enough to avoid attention. He'd seen it 1,000 times before. What Officer Mills didn't know was that the man behind the wheel of that BMW had spent the last 14 hours performing emergency surgery at Birmingham Medical Center, removing shrapnel from a construction worker's chest after an industrial accident. Dr. Marcus Washington was exhausted, running on caffeine and muscle memory, his mind still focused on the delicate work of saving lives rather than watching his speedometer. The 5-mile-per-hour excess wasn't criminal intent. It was the unconscious urgency of a trauma surgeon who'd spent 2 decades making split-second decisions in life-or-death situations. Mills flipped on his emergency lights, the red and blue strobes cutting through the humid summer darkness like searchlights hunting prey. The BMW immediately signaled and pulled onto the shoulder, stopping precisely where the white line met the grass, exactly as traffic safety protocols demanded. The driver's hands were visible on the steering wheel before Mills had even stepped out of his cruiser. Perfect compliance. Too perfect, Mills thought. Only 2 types of people followed traffic stop procedures this precisely: cops and criminals who knew the system. The shoulder of Highway 82 stretched empty in both directions, broken only by the occasional pine tree and the distant glow of a truck stop 5 miles ahead. Cicadas filled the night air with their electric chorus, and the asphalt still radiated heat from the day's 90-degree temperatures. It was the kind of isolated stretch where anything could happen, and no one would see it. Officer Derek Mills was 35 years old, 6'2", and carried himself with the aggressive confidence of someone who'd never questioned his authority. His father had been a sheriff's deputy, his grandfather a state trooper, and his great-grandfather a town marshal back when keeping the peace meant knowing which side of the tracks people belonged on. Law enforcement was in his blood, along with certain assumptions about order, authority, and the natural hierarchy of things. He'd joined the Crenshaw County Sheriff's Department straight out of high school, motivated by a genuine desire to serve and protect. But 8 years of traffic stops, domestic calls, and drug busts had hardened something inside him. The world, as Derek Mills saw it, was divided into 2 categories: people who respected authority and people who needed to be taught respect. Tonight, he was about to encounter someone who would challenge every assumption he'd ever made about which category was which. Mills approached the BMW with his right hand resting on his service weapon, his left holding a tactical flashlight that could double as a club if necessary. Standard procedure for a nighttime traffic stop, though his department's definition of standard had become increasingly aggressive over the years. The beam of his flashlight swept across the car's interior, illuminating expensive leather seats, a pristine dashboard, and the silhouette of a single occupant. The driver's window rolled down smoothly as Mills approached, revealing a black man in his early 40s wearing a navy blue button-down shirt and gold-rimmed glasses. His hands remained on the steering wheel, exactly where Mills could see them. His posture calm and respectful. No sudden movements, no nervous fidgeting, no signs of intoxication or drug use. Dr. Marcus Washington had been pulled over exactly 3 times in his adult life, twice for legitimate speeding violations during his residency when he was rushing to emergency calls, and once for what he later realized was a case of driving while black in an expensive car. He'd handled each encounter with the same disciplined calm he brought to trauma surgery. Follow procedures, remain respectful, de-escalate tension, and get through it safely. His military training had taught him that sometimes the best way to win was to avoid the fight entirely. "Good evening, officer," Dr. Washington said, his voice carrying the measured authority of someone accustomed to high-pressure situations. "I have my license and registration ready if you need them." Mills studied the man's face through the beam of his flashlight, noting the expensive glasses, the neat appearance, the educated diction. All red flags, in his experience. Drug dealers had learned to dress the part, to speak properly, to blend in with respectable society. The nicer they looked, the more carefully he watched them. "Do you know why I stopped you tonight?" Mills asked, the question delivered with the flat authority of someone who already knew the answer and wasn't interested in excuses. "I assume I was exceeding the speed limit," Dr. Washington replied calmly. "I apologize if that's the case. I've been working late and wasn't paying close enough attention to my speed." Working late. Mills had heard that excuse before, usually from people whose work involved transactions conducted in parking lots and abandoned buildings. The story was always the same: innocent explanations for suspicious behavior, reasonable-sounding excuses for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. "What kind of work keeps you out this late?" Mills asked, shining his flashlight directly into Dr. Washington's eyes. The beam was bright enough to cause temporary blindness, a technique designed to disorient and intimidate. "And what brings you through Alabama with Tennessee plates?" Dr. Washington squinted against the harsh light, but maintained his composure. "I'm a physician at Birmingham Medical Center. I was called in for an emergency surgery that ran longer than expected. I live in Memphis, but work in Birmingham. I make this drive several times a week." A doctor. Of course. Mills had learned to be suspicious of anyone who claimed a prestigious profession during traffic stops. Real doctors didn't drive alone through rural Alabama at midnight. Real doctors had assistants, drivers, people to handle their transportation. This was either a lie or a very specific type of doctor, the kind who dealt in prescriptions that never saw the inside of a pharmacy. "Step out of the vehicle, please," Mills commanded, his hand moving closer to his weapon. The polite phase of the traffic stop was over. Now came the real investigation. Dr. Washington's training kicked in, not medical training, but the deeper conditioning of 20 years in the United States Army. When a superior officer gave an order, you followed it without question or hesitation. The fact that this was a civilian traffic stop didn't change the fundamental dynamic. An armed authority figure had issued a command, and the safest response was immediate compliance. "Yes, sir," Dr. Washington said, slowly opening his door and stepping onto the asphalt shoulder. His movements were deliberate and careful. Hands visible at all times, no sudden gestures that might be misinterpreted as threatening. At 42, he was still in excellent physical condition, his 6-foot frame carrying the disciplined posture of someone who'd spent decades in uniform. Mills positioned himself tactically, keeping distance and maintaining a clear line of sight to both Dr. Washington and the interior of the BMW. This was where traffic stops got dangerous, when suspects were out of their vehicles, mobile, and potentially armed. His right hand remained near his service weapon, while his left directed the flashlight beam in a pattern designed to maintain visual dominance. "Turn around and place your hands on the roof of the vehicle," Mills ordered, his voice carrying the sharp edge of someone prepared for resistance. Dr. Washington complied immediately, pressing his palms flat against the BMW's roof and spreading his feet in the position he'd learned during military police training decades earlier. The metal was still warm from the day's heat, and the cicadas seemed to grow louder in the tense silence that followed. Mills began a thorough pat-down, his hands searching for weapons, drugs, or anything else that might justify the growing suspicion in his gut. Dr. Washington's wallet was expensive leather, his watch was a Rolex, and his clothes were clearly high-end. Either this was a very successful criminal, or Mills was making a mistake. But 8 years of experience had taught him that expensive appearances were often the best disguise. "Where are you really coming from tonight?" Mills asked, his hands finding Dr. Washington's medical identification badge clipped to his shirt pocket. "And don't tell me the hospital story again. I've heard that one before." Dr. Washington felt the officer's hands pause at his ID badge, and for a moment he thought the situation might de-escalate. Surely a medical identification from a major hospital would establish his credibility, prove that his story was legitimate. But Officer Mills barely glanced at the badge before continuing a search. In his experience, fake IDs were easy to obtain, and criminals invested in quality forgeries. A badge that looked official might actually be evidence of more sophisticated criminal activity. "I'm telling you the truth, officer," Dr. Washington said quietly, his voice maintaining the same calm professionalism he used when delivering difficult news to patients' families. "I'm a trauma surgeon. I've been in the operating room since noon today, saving a man's life. I'm just trying to get home to my family." Family. Mills had heard that one too. Everyone pulled over at midnight claimed to be rushing home to family, rushing to the hospital to see family, rushing somewhere important for family reasons. It was the universal excuse, the emotional appeal designed to generate sympathy and avoid consequences. "Really?" Mills said, his tone making it clear he didn't believe a word. "So you're telling me you're a doctor, you work at a hospital in Birmingham, you live in Memphis, and you just happen to be speeding through my county at midnight because you're a good Samaritan saving lives?" The sarcasm in the officer's voice was unmistakable, and Dr. Washington felt the first stirring of something he hadn't experienced in years, the helpless frustration of being judged not by his actions or character, but by assumptions based on his appearance. It was a feeling he'd hoped his military service and medical career had left behind, but here it was, as familiar and bitter as ever. "That's exactly what I'm telling you," Dr. Washington replied, his voice still controlled, but carrying a slight edge of steel. "Because it's the truth." What Officer Mills didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known as he stood on that dark highway making judgments based on skin color and expensive cars, was that the man he was treating like a common criminal had spent 2 decades defending the very country Mills claimed to serve. The hands he was searching for weapons had performed thousands of surgeries, saved hundreds of lives, and once carried a rifle in defense of American soldiers in some of the most dangerous places on earth. Dr. Marcus Washington had commanded men in combat, made life-and-death decisions under enemy fire, and earned the respect of everyone who'd ever served under his leadership. He'd been awarded medals for valor, commended for excellence, and trusted with responsibilities that would break most people under their weight. But standing on the side of Highway 82 with his hands on the roof of his car, while a white police officer treated him like a suspect, all of that meant nothing. His uniform was a business suit now, his rank invisible, his service record unknown. To Officer Derek Mills, he was just another black man in an expensive car who needed to be reminded of his place. The irony was about to become clear, though neither man knew it yet. Officer Mills was about to discover that authority came in many forms, and that the man he was humiliating had once held more real power than he could imagine. Dr. Washington was about to be forced to reveal a part of himself he'd kept private for years, not out of shame, but out of humility. The confrontation building between them wasn't just about a traffic stop or even about race. It was about respect, assumption, and the dangerous gap between appearance and reality. In a few minutes, everything both men thought they knew about authority, service, and each other was about to change forever. If you believe everyone deserves to be treated with dignity regardless of the color of their skin, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments about a time you witnessed someone stand up to prejudice. Because what happens next will completely change how you see respect, authority, and the power of truth to overcome hate. "Turn around," Officer Mills commanded, his patience wearing thin. "I want to see your face when you answer my questions." Dr. Washington slowly turned to face the officer, his hands still visible, his posture non-threatening. Under the harsh glare of the flashlight, Mills studied the man's features with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to read guilt in facial expressions and body language. What Mills saw frustrated him. No nervous twitching, no avoiding eye contact, no signs of deception or drug use. Just calm, steady composure that seemed almost military. The thought flickered through his mind and disappeared just as quickly. Military guys didn't drive BMWs through Alabama at midnight claiming to be doctors. "So you're a doctor," Mills said, making the word sound like an accusation. "What kind of doctor?" "Trauma surgeon," Dr. Washington replied. "Chief of trauma surgery at Birmingham Medical Center." Chief of surgery. The claim was getting bigger, more elaborate. In Mills' experience, the bigger the lie, the more desperate the criminal. Real chiefs of surgery had security details, drivers, people to handle their travel arrangements. They didn't drive themselves through backwater counties after midnight. "Prove it," Mills said, crossing his arms. "Show me some identification that says you're who you claim to be." Dr. Washington reached slowly for his wallet, telegraphing every movement to avoid triggering a defensive response. Inside were his medical license, his hospital ID badge, his American Express black card, and several other pieces of identification that should have established his credibility beyond question. Mills examined each document under his flashlight, looking for signs of forgery. The medical license looked authentic, but fake documents had become increasingly sophisticated. The hospital ID badge was professionally printed, but anyone with a computer and a laminator could produce something similar. The credit cards were real enough, but stolen cards were a common tool of the trade. "These could be fake," Mills said, handing the documents back dismissively. "Anyone can get fake IDs these days." Dr. Washington felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd presented legitimate identification from one of the most prestigious medical centers in the Southeast, and this officer was treating it like evidence of criminal activity. The situation was moving beyond a simple traffic stop into something more dangerous. "Officer, you can call Birmingham Medical Center and verify my employment," Dr. Washington said carefully. "The hospital operator can confirm that I'm on staff, that I was scheduled for surgery today, that I'm exactly who I say I am." Mills shook his head. "I'm not calling anyone at this hour. Besides, you probably have accomplices standing by to answer phones and back up your story." Accomplices. Dr. Washington realized with growing alarm that nothing he said would be believed. No evidence he presented would be accepted. In Officer Mills' mind, the verdict was already in. Guilty of being black in an expensive car with a story that sounded too good to be true. What Dr. Washington didn't know was that Officer Derek Mills had been having the worst month of his career. 3 excessive force complaints, 2 failed drug seizures that resulted in lawsuits, and 1 very unhappy sheriff who was considering transferring him to desk duty. Mills needed a win, needed an arrest that would prove his instincts were still sharp, that his aggressive tactics were justified. A black doctor in a BMW with fake identification and an elaborate cover story would be exactly the kind of arrest that could salvage his reputation. "Here's what's going to happen," Mills said, his voice taking on the hard edge of someone who'd made a decision. "You're going to assume the position, hands behind your head, and I'm going to search your vehicle for drugs, weapons, or whatever else you're carrying." Dr. Washington's mind raced. He was being treated like a criminal despite providing valid identification and a verifiable alibi. The situation was spiraling beyond rational police procedure into something that felt personal, targeted, and dangerous. "Officer, I've complied with every request you've made," Dr. Washington said, his voice still controlled but carrying an undertone of steel. "I've provided identification, answered your questions, and submitted to a search. I'm a law-abiding citizen trying to get home to my family." "Hands behind your head," Mills repeated, his right hand moving to rest on his service weapon. "Now." Dr. Washington slowly raised his hands, interlacing his fingers behind his head in the position every black man in America had learned from childhood, the position that might keep you alive when compliance was your only option, the position that reduced a chief of surgery, a lieutenant colonel, a man who'd saved countless lives, to just another suspect on the side of a dark highway. Mills approached the BMW's driver door, his flashlight beam dancing across the expensive interior. Leather seats, premium sound system, GPS navigation, all the toys that drug money could buy. He began searching methodically, looking for hidden compartments, loose panels, anything that might conceal contraband. Dr. Washington watched the violation of his property with the same forced calm he'd learned during hostile interrogations in military training. Stay quiet. Don't give them additional reasons to escalate. Focus on survival rather than dignity. But inside, something was building. Not just anger at the injustice, but recognition of a choice that was coming. He could continue to submit, continue to play the role of the compliant suspect, and hope that reasonableness would eventually prevail. Or he could reveal who he really was, pull back the curtain on his other life, and watch this officer's assumptions crumble like sand castles at high tide. The decision was coming, and Dr. Washington knew that once he made it, there would be no going back. If this story is hitting you as hard as it's hitting me, smash that subscribe button and drop a comment about a time you had to choose between staying quiet and standing up for what's right. Because what happens next will change everything you think you know about courage. Officer Mills finished searching the BMW and found nothing. No drugs, no weapons, no evidence of criminal activity. Just medical journals, surgery schedules, and a photo of Dr. Washington with his family at his daughter's graduation. But finding nothing only made Mills more suspicious. Professional criminals were smart enough to keep their cars clean. Empty your pockets, Mills commanded. Everything on the hood of the car. Dr. Washington complied, placing his wallet, keys, phone, and a small leather folder on the BMW's hood. Mills examined each item under his flashlight, looking for anything that might justify his growing conviction that this man was hiding something. The leather folder contained military challenge coins, commemorative medallions given to service members. Mills barely glanced at them. Military memorabilia was easy to buy online. Get on your knees, Mills ordered suddenly. Dr. Washington froze. The command hung in the air between them like a physical blow. Excuse me. You heard me. On your knees, hands behind your head. This was the moment Dr. Washington had been dreading and expecting in equal measure. The moment when compliance became humiliation, when following orders became surrendering dignity. The moment when he had to choose between the safety of submission and the risk of resistance. 20 years of military service had taught him when to follow orders and when to question authority. 2 decades of combat experience had shown him the difference between legitimate command and abuse of power. Officer, I've done everything you've asked, Dr. Washington said quietly. I've provided identification, submitted to a search, answered your questions. There's no legal justification for. Get on your knees. Mills shouted, his hand moving to his weapon. Now. The command echoed across the empty highway, carrying all the weight of historical oppression, all the power dynamics that had played out on roads like this for generations. A white officer ordering a black man to kneel in submission, regardless of evidence, regardless of law, regardless of human dignity. Dr. Washington looked at the asphalt, then back at Officer Mills. In that moment, he made his choice. No. What did you just say to me? Officer Mills' voice carried the dangerous edge of someone whose authority had just been challenged. Dr. Washington straightened to his full height, and something fundamental shifted in his posture. Gone was the compliant civilian trying to de-escalate a traffic stop. What emerged was something Officer Mills had never encountered before, the bearing of a man who had commanded other men in life-or-death situations. I said no, Officer Mills, Dr. Washington replied, his voice carrying a new authority. I will not kneel on this highway like a criminal when I've committed no crime beyond driving while black in your county. Mills' hand tightened on his service weapon. You're resisting a lawful order from a police officer. That's a felony. And you're violating my constitutional rights, Dr. Washington responded calmly. But before this goes any further, I think you need to understand exactly who you're dealing with. Dr. Washington reached slowly for his wallet, telegraphing every movement. But this time he pulled out a different piece of identification, one he rarely showed, one he'd hoped never to need in civilian life. "My name is Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Washington, United States Army Special Operations Command," he said, holding up his military ID. "I've served this country for 20 years in places you've never heard of, doing things you couldn't imagine." Officer Mills stared at the military identification, his brain struggling to process this new information. The ID looked authentic, official, with security features that would be impossible to fake. But it couldn't be real. Military officers didn't get pulled over on highways. They didn't drive through rural Alabama at midnight. They certainly didn't look like this. "That's fake," Mills said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" Dr. Washington asked quietly. "Would you like me to call my commanding officer? Would you like to verify my security clearance? Would you like to explain to the Pentagon why you're humiliating a decorated combat veteran on a public highway?" The words hit Officer Mills like physical blows. Security clearance, Pentagon, commanding officer. These weren't terms that criminals threw around casually. These were words that carried weight, consequences, careers-ending implications. You're really in the Army?" Mills asked, his aggressive posture beginning to waver. 20 years active duty, Dr. Washington confirmed. 3 combat deployments in Iraq, 2 in Afghanistan. I've led special operations missions, commanded forward surgical teams in hostile territory, and saved more American lives than you'll meet in your entire career. Officer Mills felt his worldview beginning to crack. Everything he thought he knew about authority, about who deserved respect, about the natural order of things, was crumbling around him. "But you're—" Mills started, then stopped, realizing how his next words would sound. "Black." Dr. Washington finished the sentence. "Yes, Officer Mills, I'm black. I'm also a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army, a chief of surgery at a major medical center, and a man who has sworn multiple oaths to defend the Constitution you're currently violating." The highway stretched empty in both directions, but Dr. Washington could see headlights in the distance, other motorists who would soon witness whatever happened next. His military training told him to control the battlefield, to shape the narrative before it shaped him. "Here's what's going to happen," Dr. Washington said, his voice carrying the command authority of someone who had directed operations in combat zones. "You're going to return my identification, apologize for this illegal detention, and allow me to continue home to my family. Or I'm going to file a formal complaint with your department, the state police, and my congressional representative, who happens to be a close personal friend." Officer Mills found himself in territory he'd never navigated before. His training had taught him to escalate force when faced with resistance, but this wasn't ordinary resistance. This was a military officer, a man whose rank technically outranked most people Mills had ever met, including his own sheriff. I didn't know," Mills stammered. "You didn't know because you didn't ask," Dr. Washington replied. "You saw a black man in an expensive car and made assumptions. You ignored valid identification, dismissed a verifiable story, and attempted to humiliate someone whose service to this country exceeds your own by decades." The truth of those words settled over Officer Mills like a weight. Everything Dr. Washington said was accurate. Mills had made assumptions, ignored evidence, and let prejudice guide his judgment. And now he was facing the consequences of those choices. "Sir, I apologize," Mills said, the word "sir" emerging automatically, a vestige of military respect trained into him by his grandfather, who had served in Vietnam. "I was just doing my job." "Your job," Dr. Washington said, "is to serve and protect, not to humiliate and intimidate. When you put on that uniform, you represent something bigger than your personal prejudices. Just like when I put on mine." Officer Mills stood in the flashing lights of his patrol car, facing a man who had just dismantled every assumption he'd made about authority, respect, and service. The black man he treated like a criminal was revealed to be everything Mills claimed to respect: a military officer, a public servant, a man who had literally fought for the freedoms Mills was supposed to protect. The revelation was complete, but the consequences were just beginning. If this moment is giving you chills like it's giving me, smash that subscribe button and drop a comment about a veteran in your life who deserves recognition. Because we're about to see how one moment of truth can change everything. Officer Mills stared at the military ID, his grandfather's voice echoing in his memory. Stories of Vietnam, of officers who commanded respect, of what real authority looked like. Without conscious thought, Mills straightened to attention. His right hand snapped to his forehead in a crisp military salute. "Sir," he whispered. Dr. Washington looked at this young officer who had just humiliated him and saw something that made him pause. Recognition. The kind that came from understanding what service really meant. Dr. Washington returned the salute. "At ease, Officer Mills." The power dynamic had completely inverted. If this moment just gave you chills, hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments what respect means to you. Because what happens next will show you the true meaning of leadership. Officer Mills lowered his hand, his face burning with shame. The man standing before him wasn't just a lieutenant colonel. He was everything Mills had been taught to respect since childhood. A combat veteran, a leader of men, a defender of the Constitution Mills had sworn to uphold. "Sir, Mills struggled to find words adequate for what he'd done. "I made a terrible mistake." Dr. Washington studied the young officer's face. He could see genuine remorse there, not just fear of consequences, but real recognition of the injustice that had occurred. It was the same look he'd seen on young soldiers' faces when they realized the weight of their actions in combat situations. "Yes, you did," Dr. Washington said quietly. "But the question now is what you're going to do about it." Mills felt the weight of that question settle on his shoulders. His entire career, his family's legacy in law enforcement, his understanding of right and wrong, everything was being measured in this moment on a dark Alabama highway. "I don't know how to fix this," Mills admitted, his voice barely audible over the cicadas and the distant hum of traffic. "You start by understanding what happened here," Dr. Washington replied. "You saw a black man in an expensive car and made assumptions. You ignored evidence, dismissed legitimate identification, and attempted to humiliate someone based on prejudice rather than facts." Each word hit Mills like a physical blow because each word was true. He'd let his biases override his training, his judgment, his basic humanity. He'd become everything his grandfather had warned him about, a cop who saw enemies instead of citizens. "I was raised better than this," Mills said, the admission torn from somewhere deep inside. "My grandfather served in Vietnam. He taught me to respect the uniform, to honor service. I don't know what happened to me." Dr. Washington saw something in that moment, not just an officer making excuses, but a young man confronting the gap between his values and his actions. It was a teachable moment, the kind that could either destroy someone or transform them. "What happened is you forgot that respect isn't earned by the uniform someone wears, but by how they treat others," Dr. Washington said. "You forgot that authority without wisdom is just power without purpose." Mills nodded, understanding flooding through him. He'd spent 8 years wielding authority, without questioning whether he was using it wisely. He'd let the badge become a shield for his prejudices rather than a symbol of service. "Sir, what you said about filing complaints," Mills began. "I could," Dr. Washington interrupted. "I could end your career with a phone call. I could have you investigated, prosecuted, turned into a national example of police misconduct." Mills waited for the other shoe to drop, knowing he deserved whatever consequences were coming. "But I'm not going to," Dr. Washington continued. "Do you know why?" Mills shook his head. "Because I've seen good men make bad choices under pressure. I've seen soldiers let fear override their training, let prejudice cloud their judgment. The measure of a person isn't whether they make mistakes, it's what they do after they realize they've made them." The words hit Mills with unexpected force. He'd expected punishment, career destruction, public humiliation. Instead, he was being offered something far more valuable and far more difficult: the chance to become better. "I want you to remember this moment," Dr. Washington said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had counseled young soldiers through their darkest hours. I want you to remember what it felt like to realize you were wrong. And I want you to use that feeling to ensure this never happens again." Mills straightened slightly, recognizing the tone of a superior officer giving a mission assignment. "Yes, sir. More importantly," Dr. Washington continued, "I want you to remember that the Constitution you've sworn to protect applies to everyone. Not just people who look like you, not just people who fit your expectations, but everyone." The lesson was sinking in, but Dr. Washington wasn't finished. He'd commanded enough young soldiers to know that real change required more than recognition. It required action. "Officer Mills, how many other traffic stops have you conducted like this one?" The question hung in the air like an indictment. Mills thought about the past 8 years, about the assumptions he'd made, the searches he'd conducted, the people he'd treated as guilty until proven innocent. "Too many," he admitted. "And how many of those people do you think were exactly what they appeared to be, law-abiding citizens trying to get home to their families?" Mills felt the full weight of his actions settling on him. How many doctors had he harassed? How many teachers, lawyers, veterans, parents, grandparents? How many people had he humiliated based on nothing more than his own prejudices? "Probably most of them," he said quietly. Dr. Washington nodded. The admission was painful but necessary. Real change began with honest acknowledgement of the problem. "Here's what's going to happen," Dr. Washington said, his voice taking on the tone of a commanding officer issuing orders. "You're going to go back to your department and recommend bias training for every officer. You're going to review your past cases and look for patterns of misconduct. And you're going to become the kind of police officer your grandfather would be proud of." Mills felt something shift inside him, not just shame for his actions, but determination to do better. The lieutenant colonel was offering him a path to redemption, but it was a path that required real work, real change, real accountability. "Sir, I will," Mills said, meaning it completely. Dr. Washington extended his hand. "Then we understand each other." Mills shook it, feeling the firm grip of a man who had made life-and-death decisions in impossible circumstances, who had earned every ounce of respect his rank commanded. "Thank you, sir," Mills said, "for not destroying my career, for giving me a chance to be better." "Don't thank me yet," Dr. Washington replied. "Thank me in 5 years when you can look back and know that you used this moment to become the officer you were meant to be." The two men stood on the highway for another moment, the flashing lights still painting the asphalt in red and blue. But something fundamental had changed. A racist cop had encountered a decorated veteran, and both men had been transformed by the collision between prejudice and truth. Officer Mills walked back to his patrol car, his mind already working on how to implement the changes Dr. Washington had challenged him to make. The traffic stop that had begun with assumptions and escalated to humiliation had ended with understanding and the possibility of redemption. Dr. Washington gathered his belongings from the hood of his BMW and prepared to continue his journey home. He'd faced down enemy fire in 3 different countries, but this highway confrontation had required a different kind of courage, the courage to show mercy when justice was within his grasp. As he drove away, Dr. Washington's phone buzzed with a text from his wife. "How was surgery?" "Drive safe. Love you." He smiled and typed back, "Surgery went well. Heading home. Had an interesting conversation with a police officer. Love you too." Some conversations changed everything. This had been one of them. 6 months later, the Crenshaw County Sheriff's Department looked different. Officer Derek Mills had kept his promise. Bias training was now mandatory. Body cameras were required for all traffic stops. A civilian oversight board reviewed complaints. The department's use of force incidents dropped by 60%. Mills himself had become the department's community liaison, building bridges instead of walls. His grandfather's Vietnam stories now inspired respect for all veterans, regardless of color. Dr. Washington received a letter one day. "Sir, I wanted you to know that your lesson stuck. I'm the officer I should have been from the beginning. Thank you for seeing the man I could become instead of just the man I was." Officer Derek Mills. The highway, where everything changed, now hosted monthly community meetings between police and citizens. Mills led most of them. One person's courage to reveal their truth had transformed an entire department's culture. Sometimes the most powerful weapon against hate is simply showing someone who you really are. 2 years after that night, on Highway 82, Lieutenant Colonel Drive Marcus Washington received an unexpected invitation. Officer Derek Mills was being promoted to sergeant, and he'd requested that Dr. Washington attend the ceremony to pin on his new stripes. "You changed my life that night," Mills said as they stood together after the ceremony. "Not by destroying me, but by believing I could be better." Dr. Washington smiled. Sometimes the best way to defeat an enemy is to turn them into a friend. The highway encounter had rippled far beyond Crenshaw County. Mills' story became a model for police departments nationwide. Dr. Washington's choice of mercy over vengeance had sparked a movement toward restorative justice in law enforcement. But perhaps the most powerful change was personal. Mills' teenage son, inspired by his father's transformation, enlisted in the Army and specifically requested to serve under officers like Dr. Washington. "I want to learn what real leadership looks like," the young man had told his father. The cycle of prejudice had been broken, replaced by respect, understanding, and service. One traffic stop. 2 men. A moment of choice that changed everything. Dr. Marcus Washington proved that true authority doesn't come from demanding respect. It comes from earning it through character, service, and the courage to show mercy when power is within your grasp. Officer Derek Mills learned that real strength isn't about forcing compliance. It's about admitting when you're wrong and having the courage to change. Their story reminds us that beneath every uniform, every job title, every assumption we make about people, there's a human being with a story worth knowing. Sometimes that story will surprise you. Sometimes it will humble you. And sometimes, if you're brave enough to listen, it will transform you. Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Marcus Washington's story proves that heroism doesn't always wear a cape. Sometimes it wears scrubs. Sometimes it carries a stethoscope. And sometimes it drives a BMW down a dark highway at midnight, carrying the quiet dignity of someone who has served something greater than themselves. If this story changed how you think about respect, authority, and the power of second chances, subscribe for more stories that reveal the extraordinary courage in ordinary moments. Comment below about someone in your life who chose mercy over revenge. And share this video because everyone deserves to see what real leadership looks like. Remember, true strength isn't about having power over others. It's about using whatever power you have to lift others up. Until next time, keep looking for the heroes hiding in plain sight. And remember that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply show someone who you really are.